So our final speaker is Erik Erwin Jahner. I'm not sure if I'm getting that.
Jahner.
Erik Erwin Jahner. He's going to talk about language, power, and isolation, translating neuroscience to education.
Yeah, so I'm going to be shifting gears quite a bit here. We're actually not going to see any neuron data or any brain data. I'm going to talk about some experiences and some problems I've discovered or been working with as I've been working with teachers and neuroscientists. To give you some background, I come from educational psychology and neurolinguistics. And then while I was getting my PhD in educational psychology, I drove all the way across Los Angeles to do my lab work with fMRI. And now I've moved out here to Singapore, and I work with the National Institute of Education, where we're trying to build a Science of Learning center. But as we've been doing that, I've been communicating with neuroscientists and educators and seeing some places where there's some problems, and I want to kind of talk about that today. So in the 90s, an article was published, A Bridge Too Far. If you haven't read this, it's a very good, very interesting article, talking about how do we get from neuroscience to education? Can we take neuroscience and just translate it into education and do something in the lab and then create a classroom practice? This article looked at a lot of the issues that were coming up, such as neuromyths and places where teachers were reading the literature, misinterpreting it, creating new classroom practices based on that literature. But I'm going to be focusing on this translation, on this bridge too far. And I want you to notice that when we look at this, there is a line going translation from neuroscience to education. So do we fix this with little small bridges? And this has been something that's been proposed. Do we go from neuroscience to cognition to education, or even from cognitive neuroscience to education? But we're still dealing with something very linear. We're talking about a handoff between neuroscience and education. This is a multidisciplinary approach, not an interdisciplinary approach. Each level is still separated in a lot of ways. The idea of translation carries with it this metaphor. I mean, we also think about other metaphors like time is money, argumentation is a battle. The brain, of course, is a filing system, a computer. Is it a network? Is it a living thing? We use these metaphors, and these metaphors constrain or open up ways for us to think about problems. But what if, for example, we thought about argumentation as a dance instead of as a battlefield? It changes the way we think about problems and changes the way we think about the problem space. Translation as a metaphor restricts the way we're thinking about the problem, but it also reflects some of the problems that exist. Translation brings to mind how language is used to reinforce power relations. It brings to mind who has the correct form of knowledge. Is there one form that is better than another? Is there a higher form? Is there a language that is more prestigious than another one? And where neuroscience and education interact, often neuroscience is seen as the prestigious language. But translation also leads to separations. Just like we have boundaries between countries, translation makes us think of the separation between neuroscience and education. And often, when I've been out here working with neuroscientists and with educators, as we're writing grants, as we're working in labs, we see a separation not only in the philosophy and the language and the way they're speaking, but separate places. Research is done in the lab for the neuroscientist, it's done in the classroom for the educator. So sometimes what we see is the neuroscientist does all their work in the lab and says, here's our results, now it's your job to translate it, educators. And the educators are like, okay, we'll do our best. And then it often happens at different times as well. So a grant is set up where you have the neuroscience portion being the first stage, then the education portion being the second stage, and often there's like a clear break between the two, and there's not a movement of the neuroscientists into the education field or from educators into the neuroscience field. So what are some basic barriers that I've come up across? And I want to share these with you to show you some of the things that individuals are saying or problems that we have in communicating, and I think that really illustrates some of the separation. I often hear this: I don't understand what the neuroscientists are saying. They may have a deeper understanding of learning because they work in a more complex field. This is this elevation of neuroscience again, above education, as if it is a better field. And there's some very interesting ways of noticing this too with the language in terms of neuroscience uses a Latinate and Greek-based language a lot in what they're saying, so sometimes we are literally translating it into English for other fields. And often I hear, oh, they're using such big words. So this separation is there in the way teachers are talking about education as well. We might hear reactions to talks like this. As I've been to Mindbrain education or educational psychology, I'll hear, oh, they're measuring electromagnetic potentials. That must be real science. They're really doing something that's really hard and interesting. And it's done almost in a mocking way. Or the opposite, they do a praise, and they're like, oh, I don't know what she's talking about, but it must be really important because I don't understand it, right? And they love the talk. It was really influential, got them really energized, and they're ready to go back and teach in their classroom with stuff they didn't actually understand. But this happens all the time. So these are things to be aware of. So when we're talking with educators, make sure the understanding is there on both sides. Also, there's this belief, and I think this exists also within the neuroscience community and within the teaching community, that neuroscience is somehow more objective. And as we were just talking about, like when we were looking at fMRI, we're not really looking at exactly what's going on inside the brain. We're making inferences all the time. And educators, when they're doing studies, educational researchers are using indicators like surveys, like tests. And they need to remember that they are actually using indicators. They're not measuring real knowledge. Just as we as neuroscientists need to remember that we are not measuring real knowledge when we're looking at fMRI, we're using indicators to understand changes in the brain. We need to triangulate and come together and see both sides as valid, both ways of getting that information. And again, is the biological approach more objective? As we were just talking about with fMRI, we're not measuring neurons directly. Also, I often hear this when educators come to talks that neuroscientists are giving. And as neuroscientists are giving these talks, we need to be aware that they may see us as Google, right? They may come to us and they may ask, how does this work in education? My student is having this trouble. How does this work? And they assume that because you're a neuroscientist, you do have all these answers because you understand the brain. So it's really good when we start off talks talking about neuroscience with educators to begin by saying, you know what, we don't have all the answers. We come from a different field. We want to have a conversation with you. We don't want to come and teach you how to do your job. And one solution that has come up is perhaps taking this linear trajectory here from neuroscience to education research to education application, and instead asking teachers, what do teachers want to learn from neuroscience? What problems can be solved? But one of the problems with looking at it in this way, in this circular way, is this actually just reinforcing this translational paradigm? Are we still seeing this separation, but now we're saying, oh, the teachers will just feed the beginning, so we just keep feeding this loop, but we're not actually integrating. We want to build an interdisciplinary space, not some handoff where one research group is handing information to the next group and then saying, okay, we want you to translate this. We want a partnership all the way through. And this is where science of learning is actually going to develop. And I think this is where there's some good, interesting research coming out, but of course it's incredibly messy. And that's what makes it very hard. When we're doing research in the real world, it is very messy. But we need to basically lock gears with education. It's not one feeding the other. They should be working with each other and feeding back and forth and having a constant interaction. One of the models we use in education is Bronfenbrenner's model. And one thing I want to remind us here is in the center of Bronfenbrenner's model is the individual. And we could see, like, for example, a connectivity network in the mind. But this connectivity network is not just held within the brain. This connectivity is with the social structures around us. It's with our parents, it's with our teachers, it's with the tools that we're using in the classroom, it's with what we do at home, it's how we move through the world. So this is an area where neuroscience can look at connectivity not just within the brain, but between the brain and the outside world as it moves through time, and how the brain changes based on which type of culture is it in, which type of classroom is it in. These are important questions that need to be answered, but they're not being addressed very well right now. There's a few studies that are looking at it, and there's a few studies here in Singapore that are looking at this, but we don't have a full-on look at this. A lot of times what's happening is research begins, and it falls apart early because you have two groups that are having a lot of trouble communicating with each other. One approach is mind-brain education, and this is an interdisciplinary approach that brings together psychology, neuroscience, and educators in order to find out where do they have shared interest. And this often is very tough. And you have to expect interdisciplinary work to be very tough. So going in and talking to teachers, there's going to be moments where those teachers put you on a pedestal. There's going to be moments where teachers look and say, oh, I think you're brilliant, but I don't know what you're saying. And dealing with that tension is difficult. But getting to know them and learning from them and having them learn from you is very, very rewarding when you're actually in that position. And right now in Singapore, we're at a very interesting place because we're beginning to move into this area. NRF is beginning to look and say, oh, we want to put some more funding into this. We want to understand how the brain influences education. But we're also in a dangerous area, right? This is the same thing that happened around the world that Brewer actually referred to when he was saying, we can see situations where we might have an education system that says, oh, let's type our students. Let's give them a neural test. Let's give them a genetics test. And then let's move them through the education based on that. That's not the direction we want to go. And I don't think anybody in this room would think that way. And doesn't think neuroscience has the answers in that way. Because we're looking at a very plastic brain in a very plastic world. And it's important to work together in the same space, not to work in separate spaces. Thank you, and I would really welcome any feedback you guys have as far as ways that you think you can work within this interdisciplinary space better.
Thank you, Erik, for bringing this perspective to this hall. So it's not a question, but more of a comment that, you know, as you mentioned, one of the things we're doing in the hall, as you know, is that we are still discovering a lot about what is happening in the brain, and so we don't have the answer. So if we are thinking about applying it to education, what we're learning, as messy as the process is, you know, we also are talking about students whose lives are in some way, you know, we're influencing them. So having half-baked ideas or ideas which are potentially, you know, we don't know enough about, how do you think about, you know, actually translating something like that?
Actually, I think those half-baked ideas are important to integrate education with, right? So we begin to talk to teachers during that half-baked stage and get actual practice in classrooms, actual practice in real life, looking at neuroscience in those questions. And the teachers might have interesting insight, but to come to them and say, hey, this idea is not fully fleshed out. Let's figure it out together, because they might have new ways of looking at it that we didn't think about looking at. Like another thing I've often heard is we talk about like the controlled condition. So we have a room, so this is one thing I see in neuroscience and cognitive science research. There's a room where somebody's put alone to begin studying a math skill. We measure what's going on when they're studying that math skill. We see if there's neural changes based on different practices. But we forget sometimes that that controlled condition is actually a specific type of teaching condition. Putting somebody in a room all by themselves and teaching them to learn is very different than putting them in a classroom and teaching them to learn. The whole system has to work together. It's not really a control condition. It's a different condition altogether. Other comments?
So I'm curious, like how some ideas are adapted by the education field. For example, just the first talk this evening, this morning, by Stanislav, right, about arousal affecting performance. And this brings to mind the old thing, this so-called Yerkes-Dodson law about performance, right? So how do things like that fit in? Because you obviously want the students to be aroused in some way. That's one thing, which to me is very obvious. And the other thing is just from the other talk we heard about the circadian effect, right? I would say it's well established, like for teenagers, for example, they perform better later in the morning, and yet the school system still insists on starting them really early in the morning. Now, how many years do we have to say that this is what the neuroscience is saying before the education people will take a notice of this, right?
Yes. Very fair point. This is one of the things that's very frustrating to us who work interdisciplinary, when sometimes there is something that's been shown in one field and it's like, okay, we've seen all the evidence, but it's not translating into education. The one thing that does make it difficult is, that I've learned, is by really trying to get in the school and understand what kind of problems are they actually dealing with, because sometimes the problems are much more complex than we notice. There are socioeconomic problems that may influence the time that school is starting. There might be sports that are going on in the school that are going to influence the time school is starting, but they're not, and they're thinking about bus schedules. But we can look with them and say, okay, well, you know what, maybe we can start school earlier for primary age students, and for secondary age students, it starts later, but maybe they didn't consider that. But we didn't come with them and discuss that with them, so they were like, oh, it's just unfeasible. We can't do what the research is saying because it just doesn't work in our system. That's why I think it's so important to, when we're working with education, to actually get in those situations and not only understand what is the effect on the brain from one particular, from development or from some type of practice that you're doing, but what is the effect of dealing with all those different economic variables that are around the individual, all the social variables that are around the individual, that are going to see whether or not this is actually going to work in the real world and how it could work in the real world.
Yeah, great talk, Erik. Thanks. I had a question following up on what you were discussing with Suresh, which is, you know, we've only really had evidence-based medicine since the 1980s, right? So it's 40 years or less. And it's only been in the last decade or so that people are talking about, you know, evidence-based everything, right? So to what extent do you see the education field embracing evidence-based methods like randomized controlled trials and meta-analyses of those?
The randomized controlled trials is a very messy thing, and it's not very easy to do randomized controlled trials, especially in the Ministry of Education has found some troubles in trying to actually implement that here. But I think the right way to go is to begin to think about it in more of a complex system approach and try to take into account more of the variables, as many of the variables as we can. For example, just looking at what the individual is learning and then taking that individual into the fMRI and seeing what's changed and then plop them back in the classroom is not enough. We need to actually have people observing the individual in the classroom, in the community, to try to find out what are those other covariates we haven't accounted for. So I think there's some place in between doing randomized control trials and really just doing observations out in the real world and trying to see what's actually going on in education, because education is a place where neuroscience can be studied. It doesn't just have to be studied in the lab. It can be studied both places.
Can you give us an example of an issue with an RCT that's a sort of a deal breaker for MOE? I can't think of one off the top of my head.
Sorry. But some of the issues that often come up, for example, is there's different groups of classes that are already being given a specific treatment versus another treatment. They've also leveled the different classes so that there's different levels. And whenever we're breaking up the schools, it's trying to figure out, okay, which schools actually are of the same level or are comparable, because we might pick one school that is not being tested with something else and another school that's not being tested, but they're not quite comparable. And those kinds of issues come up all the time. So it's not like, in fact, if you just take the same teacher and look at that same teacher from year to year, her classes are going to be, or his or her classes are going to be drastically different from each other, but we pretend as if those are pretty much the same. But every teacher that teaches knows, no, my lesson plan I made this year is not going to work next year. I'm going to have to figure out how it works with a new class, with a new group of students. So the variation in the system makes it very difficult. But I think also fun.
Okay, Erik, thanks so much for that. That was a very nuanced discussion.